Chapter 5, Part 1. Only 3 dynamic things happened that year to vary the noiseless tenor of Emily's way. In the autumn, she had a love affair, as Aunt Laura Victorianly phrased it. Reverend James Wallace, the new, well-meaning, ladylike young minister at Dairy Pond, began making excuses for visiting Blairwater Manse quite often, and from there drifted over to New Moon. Soon, everybody in Blairwater and Dairy Pond knew that Emily Starr had a ministerial beau. Gossip was very rife. It was a foregone conclusion that Emily would jump at him. A minister! Heads were shaken over it. She would never make a suitable minister's wife. Never in the world. But wasn't it always the way? A minister picking on the very last girl he should have. At New Moon, opinion was divided. Aunt Laura, who owned to a Dr. Fell feeling about Mr. Wallace, hoped Emily wouldn't take him. Aunt Elizabeth, in her secret soul, was not over fond of him either, but she was dazzled by the idea of a minister. And such a safe lover. A minister would never think of eloping. She thought Emily would be a very lucky girl if she could get him. When it became sadly evident that Mr. Wallace's calls at New Moon had ceased, Aunt Elizabeth gloomily asked Emily the reason, and was horrified to hear that the ungrateful minx had told Mr. Wallace she could not marry him. "Why?" demanded Aunt Elizabeth, in icy disapproval. "His ears, Aunt Elizabeth, his ears," said Emily flippantly. "I really couldn't risk having my children inherit ears like that." The indelicacy of such a reply staggered Aunt Elizabeth, which was probably why Emily had made it. She knew Aunt Elizabeth would be afraid to refer to the subject again. The Reverend James Wallace thought it was his duty to go west the next spring, and that was that. Part 2. Then there was the episode of the local theatricals in Shrewsbury, which were written up with vitriolic abuse in one of the Charlottetown papers. Shrewsbury people blamed Emily Bird Starr for doing it. Who else, they demanded, could or would have written with such diabolic cleverness and sarcasm? Everyone knew that Emily Bird Starr had never forgiven Shrewsbury people for believing those yarns about her in the old John House affair. This was her method of revenge. Wasn't that like the Murrays, carrying a secret grudge for years, until a suitable chance for revenge presented itself? Emily protested her innocence in vain. It was never discovered who had written the report, and as long as she lived, it kept coming up against her. But in one way, it worked out to her advantage. She was invited to all the social doings in Shrewsbury after that. People were afraid to leave her out, lest she write them up. She could not get to everything. Shrewsbury was 7 miles from Blairwater. But she got to Mrs. Tom Nicholls' dinner dance, and thought for 6 weeks that it had changed the current of her whole existence. Emily in the glass looked very well that night. She had got the dress she had longed for years, spent the whole price of a story on it to her aunt's horror. Shot silk, blue in one light, silver in another, with mists of lace. She remembered that Teddy had said that when she got that dress, he would paint her as an ice maiden in it. Her right-hand neighbor was a man who kept making funny speeches all through the meal, and kept her wondering for what good purpose God had ever fashioned him. But her left-hand neighbor, he talked little, but he looked. Emily decided that she liked a man whose eyes said more than his lips. But he told her she looked like the moonbeam of a blue summer night in that gown. I think it was that phrase that finished Emily, shot her clean through the heart, like the unfortunate little duck of the nursery rhyme. Emily was helpless before the charm of a well-turned phrase. Before the evening was over, Emily, for the first time in her life, had fallen, wildly and romantically, into the wildest and most romantic kind of love. The love the poets dreamed of, as she wrote in her diary. The young man, I believe his beautiful and romantic name was Aylmer Vincent, was quite as madly in love as she. He literally haunted New Moon. He wooed beautifully. His way of saying, "Dear lady," charmed her. When he told her that a beautiful hand was one of the chief charms of a beautiful woman, and looked adoringly at hers, Emily kissed her hands when she went to her room that night because his eyes had caressed them. When he called her raptly a creature of mist and flame, she misted and flamed about dim old New Moon, until Aunt Elizabeth unthinkingly quenched her by asking her to fry up a batch of doughnuts for Cousin Jimmy. When he told her she was like an opal, milk white outside, but with a heart of fire and crimson, she wondered if life would always be like this. And to think I once imagined I cared for Teddy Kent, she thought in amazement at herself. She neglected her writing and asked Aunt Elizabeth if she could have the old blue box in the attic for a hope chest. Aunt Elizabeth graciously acceded. The record of the new suitor had been investigated and found impeccable. Good family, good social position, good business. All the omens were auspicious. Part 3. And then a truly terrible thing happened. Emily fell out of love just as suddenly as she had fallen into it. One day she was, and the next she wasn't. That was all there was to it. She was aghast. She couldn't believe it. She tried to pretend the old enchantment still existed. She tried to thrill and dream and blush. Nary thrill, nary blush. Her dark-eyed lover, why had it never struck her before that his eyes were exactly like a cow's? Bored her. I bored her. She yawned one evening in the very midst of one of his fine speeches. Why, there was nothing to him but fine speeches. There was nothing to add to that. She was so ashamed that she was almost ill over it. Blair people thought she had been jilted and pitied her. The aunts, who knew better, were disappointed and disapproving. Fickle, fickle, like all the stars, said Aunt Elizabeth bitterly. Emily had no spunk to defend herself. She supposed she deserved it all. Perhaps she was fickle. She must be fickle. When such a glorious conflagration fizzled out so speedily and utterly into ashes, not a spark of it left, not even a romantic memory. Emily viciously inked out the passage in her diary about the love the poets dreamed of. She was really very unhappy about it for a long while. Had she no depth at all? Was she such a superficial creature that even love with her was like the seeds that fell into the shallow soil in the immortal parable? She knew other girls had these silly, tempestuous, ephemeral affairs, but she would never have supposed she would have one, could have one. To be swept off her feet like that by a handsome face and mellifluous voice, and great dark eyes, and a trick of pretty speeches. In brief, Emily felt that she had made an absolute fool of herself, and the Murray pride could not stick it. To make it worse, the young man married a Shrewsbury girl in 6 months. Not that Emily cared whom he married or how soon, but it meant that his romantic ardors were but things of superficiality too, and lent a deeper tinge of humiliation to the silly affair. Andrew had been so easily consoled also. Perry Miller was not wasting in despair. Teddy had forgotten her. Was she really incapable of inspiring a deep and lasting passion in a man? To be sure, there was Dean. But even Dean could go away winter after winter, and leave her to be wooed and won by any chance-met suitor. Am I fundamentally superficial? Poor Emily demanded of herself with terrible intensity. She took up her pen again with a secret gladness. But for a considerable time, the love-making in her stories was quite cynical and misanthropic in its flavor.